Hey there friends, Alex Oaks here, and today I have a camera review for you. Probably one of the more interesting cameras in my collection, not because of what the camera is, but because of how long this particular camera was available for sale. Today I'm reviewing the Graflex Century 35, a 35mm fixed lens rangefinder from the late 1950s, but this camera isn't exactly what it appears to be. So let's head back to the studio and I can give you a brief background of where this interesting camera came from. And I'll see you back here in a few. So what makes the Century 35 so unique among all the cameras I've reviewed is its unique history. Most cameras are produced by a single company from start to finish. Sometimes there's name changes, sometimes there's ownership changes. But in the case of the Century 35, there are 4 separate companies to cover for its history. So let's break it down. The Graflex came from Fulmer and Schwing, a bicycle and gas lighting manufacturer that was started in New York in 1887. They would get into manufacturing cameras by 1898, and by 1905, they were a part of Eastman Kodak out of Rochester. After a series of antitrust rulings, Graflex was spun off as its own independent company by the late 1920s. They of course continued producing their iconic press cameras, but by the mid-century, they started to look at getting into the roll film market, as they found by the middle of the 20th century that most photographers were starting to use medium format or 35mm cameras. The second company to break down is Kowa. Kowa formed as originally a textile trading company in 1896 in Japan. They quickly got into actually spinning and weaving by 1916, and by the 1950s started producing cameras. The next two are kind of the same. The first being the Candid Camera Company in 1936 out of Chicago, Illinois. They produced a nice 35mm rangefinder called the CYA 35. They were sold very quickly to the Ciro Corporation, originally out of Ohio and then later moving to Detroit, Michigan, who continued production of this camera called the Ciro 35. In the pursuit to produce a 35mm camera, Graflex took a completely different means of getting there. Unlike previous cameras they've produced and designed in-house, they decided that they were just going to purchase something wholesale and bought out the entire Ciro Corporation, took their 2 cameras, a TLR and the Ciro 35, and slapped their name on it. The Graflex Ciro 35 hit the markets in the early 1950s and was relatively well received. Graflex knew very early on that they had no way of wresting the professional market away from well-established German manufacturers. But in Japan, camera manufacturing was also booming, with Kowa deciding to get out of simply producing optics like rifle scopes, binoculars, opera glasses, and spotting scopes, and get into camera manufacturing. In 1954, they released their first camera, the Kowa Kallo Flex TLR, which was actually half decent if I am reading the reviews right for a mid-century TLR from Japan. In 1955, however, Kowa also decided to break into 35mm and released the Kallo 35, a 35mm rangefinder with a fixed lens available in 3 different options. Graflex, however, decided to take the Ciro 35 and rebuild it from the ground up, and released it as the Graphic 35. The Graphic 35 was a unique camera in the sense that it had the spectromatic metering system for manually setting the exposure when using flash bulbs by pushing a button and using different color codes. It also had an interesting push button focusing system for the rangefinder. Rather than focusing on the lens helical or using a separate dial and a geared interface, you would push 2 buttons to focus the lenses in and out. But by 1957, Graflex was starting to have financial problems and was starting to get passed around to different companies, and it was decided that they needed to lessen the cost of producing cameras, canceled the Graphic 35, and looked to Japan. Graflex and Kowa would come to an agreement in 1957 to produce special versions of the Kallo 35 under the Graflex name. The camera, the Century 35, would be released in 1957 and come with 2 of the 3 lens options that the Kallo 35 originally had. These cameras were primarily branded with Graflex and Century 35 on the front, but if you look carefully, you can find the Kowa name on the back of the film body, and inside the film door, you can actually see that it was manufactured directly for Graflex to be sold in the North American market. It was an interesting arrangement that only lasted for about a year, with the Kallo 35 ceasing production in 1958. And thus the Century 35 ended as well. It remained on sale for another couple of years, and Kowa and Graflex did not break their agreement, and they would release a new version of the camera, the Century 35A, based on the Kallo 35N. Although many people see this second model as a downgrade compared to the original Kallo 35. Of course, this would continue until Graflex ceased production. Graflex ceased to exist as a company in 1973, and all its assets, surprisingly, ended up in Japanese manufacturers. Kowa, however, still produces sports optics to this day. Okay, that about covers it, so let's take a closer look at the Century 35. And here it is. This is the Graflex Century 35. I'll admit, I have a soft spot for mid-century rangefinders, but most of the ones I've used in the past are from the 1960s, not the 1950s. And there is a distinct difference between the two. The first thing that really strikes me right off the bat is how heavy this thing is. Like, it is not a light camera at all. It is all metal. There's no plastic on it whatsoever. And it just has a unique look and feel to it. It's very Art Deco, Art Modern in its design and feel. Yeah, no, honestly, for its age, this camera is in surprisingly good condition. I really have my good friend John Meadows to thank for that. This was a wonderful gift from him after I used it for a CCR episode a couple of seasons ago. And there is actually a beauty in its simplicity. It really, really works. Now, if you know where to look, you can actually find the Kowa branding on it. So the first one is here on the back of the film door. And then the second one is actually inside, where you can see that it was manufactured for Graflex. So Graflex didn't just buy a bunch of these cameras, slap their name on it, and call it a day. They actually told Kowa that we're going to pay for the manufacturing of specific models of the Kallo 35. What's also neat is that the former owner actually scratched in their SIN number down on the bottom. No, it's definitely a beautiful camera. I really like the look and feel of it, and I don't take it out that often because I have much better, much easier to use cameras. The one thing, yeah, that's really about it. So let's take a closer look at some of the functionality of the camera. If you're used to working with mid-century, especially 1950s fixed lens rangefinders, the Century 35 is actually fairly easy to operate and use as a photographer's camera. As a rangefinder, it does have two windows here at the front. You have your main viewfinder here and the secondary rangefinder window. It is a single combined viewfinder rangefinder that does have some nice frame lines and a decent size rangefinder patch in it. So you don't have to worry about switching back and forth between a viewfinder window and a rangefinder window. On the front, all your exposure controls are centered around the lens itself. These two knobs sort of on a weird offset on the lens barrel, these are to aid in focusing, and I find it really weird. I would have preferred if they were a little bit further along, but whatever. On the side here, you're going to notice this green tab. That allows you to change your aperture, and there's a little tiny window up here. So it's actually half decent. I really like this lens working at f8. Also along the top, you're going to see your shutter speed indicator, and that is this front ring here. It's a little stiff on my copy, but I'm just going to chalk that up to age. But what is really nice is that if you aren't a fan of the rangefinder, it does have this lovely depth of field counter calculator right here. It looks like the ideal depth of field for this lens is f11. So you'd basically set your aperture to f11, and then you'd put the infinity stop here, and then you get to about 8 feet. 8 feet? Yes, 8 feet on the other end, which gives you more than enough depth of field, especially with a 48mm lens. On the top here, you have a manual frame counter. I generally tend to ignore this and just count up the different shots. Your film advance lever, not bad, and your shutter release is up here. Have a cold accessory shoe. I love that the fact that it has it on this body. I can put a light meter on here, such as the AstrHori XH2 or the Reveni Labs unit, and it really doesn't interfere with any of the camera operations. You have a film speed reminder on this side, and this is also your take-up knob. You pull it up all the way to bring this collar up, and that allows you to easily load the film, and you only need to pull it up part way, and that gives you enough room when rewinding. On the bottom, there's your rewind release. The problem is you do have to press and hold it when rewinding the film. And then on the side right here is your film door release. Open it up, and you have your take-up spool here and the cavity where you put your 35mm cartridge. So, but the one thing you need to remember is that you need to physically lock it back closed when you're done. And then wind, click, and you're good to go. So why don't we get this thing loaded up with film and get out into the field. Okay, so today I'm here in Oakville, Ontario. I'm a little bit east of the downtown core and a neighborhood of the city that I don't come to that often and haven't been to in a while. So nice for a little bit of change of scenery. I'm going to be using the AstrHori XH2 light meter to set my exposure today because I really want to travel light. I have my camera loaded with a roll of Fomapan 100, and I'm going to be developing it in LegacyPro Mic X using the stock dilution. So normally in reviews like these, I will do a bit of a montage of me working the camera while I share some of the photos. But because of the age concerns I have with this camera, instead I'm just going to be presenting a montage of my favorite images I captured today while I talk a little bit about my experience using the camera. All right, so without further ado, let's get walking, and I'll see you back here after I'm done. While I'm not a regular rangefinder user, I still have a soft spot for mid-century fixed lens rangefinders. And the Century 35, well, it has some pain points, offers up an experience like my first real camera, one about a decade older than this one. Loading film can take some time. The take-up spool uses a metal piece that you have to slide the film into, so using a film with a thinner base works the best. There are some frame spacing issues as well, but I'm going to chalk that up to age more than the camera itself. Even if you're not used to using a rangefinder, the rangefinder patch on this camera is still contrasty, and composing using a 48mm focal length can be challenging, but the frame lines and parallax correction fine lines make it a little bit easier. And if you're still not good with that, use the depth of field guide on the camera itself. The two protrusions on the lens barrel makes it very easy to focus, and surprisingly the helical is still smooth after almost half a century. Exposure is set by a dial and a lever for the aperture, and both settings are easily read looking down. Now there is no meter on the camera, but an accessory shoe meter like the Reveni Labs or the XH2 work really well on this camera. The shutter advance isn't too long, and the shutter makes a very satisfying pop noise when released. You are going to need both hands to rewind the film, as you have to use the knob and hold down the release on the bottom of the camera. While far different from other fixed lens rangefinders that I've used, the Century 35 isn't too bad, but it does weigh a lot in the hand without a strap, and walking and shooting a roll of 36, you really feel the pain in your wrist afterwards. All right, so camera optics. Now, unlike some of the cameras I've reviewed, the Century 35 has a fixed lens. Now, this is a 48mm f2.8, which is, you know, interesting for a rangefinder, but honestly, there's nothing wrong with the lens. So let's head back to the studio and I can talk to you a bit about what my further thoughts on the optics of this camera and some of the other ones available on this particular model. So the Kallo 35, when it was initially released under the Kowa branding, came with 3 different lens options. You had a 45mm f3.5, a 48mm f2.8, and a 50mm f2. These were all the same basic lens. They were the Kowa Optical Works Prominar FC. So the lens itself is coated, which means using color film and help with avoiding lens flare is actually mitigated because of the coating. And optically, Kowa produced amazing optics for what they were. They weren't a well-known camera manufacturer in Japan, but they did produce excellent optics at a fair price. When Graflex started contracting Kowa out, they only wanted 2 different versions of the lens, and that would be the 45mm f3.5 and the 48mm f2.8. I really don't know why they picked those 2. Honestly, I would have said as Graflex, let's do the 50mm f2 and the 45mm f3.5. 45mm seems to be a sweet spot for rangefinder cameras and lenses and focal lengths, and I actually really like the 45mm framing. I got to know that focal length very well with my Minolta system, both the XGM and the XE7 with the wonderful Rokkor X 45mm f2. And in the Canon lineup, the 40mm f2.8 STM for the Canon EF mount is also wonderful. But focal lengths aside, I'm actually really glad that I got the slightly faster version of it with f2.8. Not that I'm going to be out shooting 2.8. I like it because the 48mm offers up a bit of a challenge. It's not quite a 45 and it's not quite a 50. It's sort of the red-headed stepchild, that really weird middle child. And I don't know about you, but I really like that challenge. Optically, I haven't found any real problem with the camera. Now, I haven't shot it wide open at f2.8, so I don't know if there are any problems with vignetting or fall off at the corners, but based on the general size of that front element and the overall size of the camera and the wide open aperture being f2.8, I'm going to say no. I also find that it doesn't have any real distortion. And again, I haven't focused it up close. I use it a lot more for architecture, landscape, street work. So I can't really see any problems with barrel or pinching in the distortion field with this lens. And my straight line still looks straight when I scan the film. The lens itself has held up well. My copy is in really good shape. I wish I could tell you what the optical construction of this lens is, but that information I've not been able to find online. But yeah, honestly, if you are looking at getting either the Kallo 35 or the Graflex Century 35, and you are a rangefinder user, look for the 45mm lens if you can. You'll probably find that a lot more accessible and a lot easier to compose your images. And that about covers it for this video. Have you ever used any of Graflex's 35mm cameras? Have you used the really interesting Graflex 35 or the Century 35? Any of Kowa's cameras? Let me know in the comments. If you like what you see, please consider subscribing and hitting that bell notification icon to let you know when I release new videos. And at the very least, if you like what you see, give me a thumbs up. Every little bit helps. Until next time, my name's Alex Laux. Shoot what you love, with what you love, on what you love. Don't give in to the hype.